On this video, I'm going to talk about JP Morgan's Premier Income Fund and the positives and negatives associated with it. So far this year, the JP Morgan JEPI ETF has received a lot of inflows. In fact, it's one of the top 10 in the world when it comes to the inflows so far this year. So a lot of investors are buying it around the world. Should you be one of them? And that's going to be what I'm going to talk about today. And before doing that, go over to adamfire.com, especially if you're an expat or a high net wealth individual, and see how I can help you and indeed have helped people like you in the past. Now, this particular fund is paying over 12% per year dividends on a monthly basis. So right now it's paying 1% per month in dividends. And because it's gone down a little bit in value, it's also got the potential for capital growth. However, how is it actually getting this high income yield? Basically, most of the fund is invested in stocks, but about 20% is in structured notes, which is very much a professional, complicated asset class. And this kind of leads me to the first negative of the fund, that in a very severe financial crisis, you could always have a situation where some of the financial institutions default on these particular contracts, because structured notes are created by various banks. And basically what we've seen at the moment with Credit Suisse is if Credit Suisse had some structured notes, they could potentially have defaulted on those. We're going to find out more about that, I think, in the next few months. But that's one thing to bear in mind, that most of the income, at least, is being produced by the structured note positions, even though the structured note is only about 20% of the total fund, and it does add complexity. That's one thing. Secondly, we have to bear in mind that this 12% yield won't last forever. It's true that right now it's a very good yield, and I expect it to last for a little while. But the reason why 12% is currently the rate, and historically it's been more like 5 or 6%, is the capital value has gone down. And when it comes to income producing ETFs, it's very much like, let's say you buy a house, right? And let's say you buy a house in London or New York and the capital value goes up. The rental yield tends to go down because there's only so much you can pay on rent, right? But vice versa, when capital values go down like they are now in the UK, and especially in 2009, rental yields tend to go up because rents aren't going to go down just because the value of the house is going down. And even though stocks are a bit different, in general, when it comes to the stock market, when the stock market goes down, dividend yields go up. Not for every company, because some companies stop paying dividends, but in general, that's the way how things work. Conversely, if the capital appreciation is very high, the dividend yield tends to go down. Now, whilst that's a good thing in terms of whenever stock markets go down, if you reinvest the income, that is obviously a good way to take advantage of markets falling, right? Let's say right now the FTSE 100 is given a 4% or so dividend yield. Let's say the FTSE goes down a lot and it's given a 5 or 6% dividend yield, and you reinvest that back in. Obviously, that's a good way of investing. But bear in mind that with this particular fund, assuming the capital value recovers, which I think it probably will, it will go down, this particular dividend yield. So the 12% is not going to last forever. In fact, JP Morgan themselves say that they expect long term that the fund will give 5 to 6%, income, dividends, and 1 to 2% capital growth. So what they're actually hoping for is to get a 7 or 8% total return with quite low volatility. Now, that brings me to another point, and that's the long term. The S&P 500 is given 10 to 11% returns, and the Nasdaq actually is given higher returns, albeit with very high volatility. So buying this fund, don't assume that it's a fund that's going to beat the S&P 500 long term. Yes, it might beat a 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, and it might even beat a 60-40 portfolio with lower volatility. However, it's very unlikely to beat the S&P 500 very long term, because it's actually not aiming to do that. It's merely a fund which is aiming to not go down by a lot, not be super high volatility, and also give good dividend yields. So whilst it might be a good play for this year and maybe next year or whatever, long term, I don't expect the fund to beat the S&P 500, or for that matter, the Nasdaq. That's not the aim of the fund, and people going into it have to understand that. And one of the reasons also why it won't be the S&P 500 or NASDAQ adjusted for fees and taxes is high dividend yield is more likely to expose you to higher taxes. So obviously this depends where you live. If you live in the US, it gets very complicated, but I think quite a lot of that fund can be taxed. But for non-Americans, you've also got to bear in mind that this is based in the United States. There's a high chance that you're going to pay 25% to the US government from the dividends. That automatically brings down the net dividends below 10%. So that's another thing to bear in mind, that even if it did match the S&P 500 long term, which is unlikely, net of taxes, it's unlikely to, because of the dividends and the fact it's a US based fund. And there are other dividend paying funds and ETFs which are domiciled on the London Stock Exchange and Europe and Canada and so on. So another point and a final point to remember is this: when a fund is actively managed, you are taking on another risk in terms of the fund managers could be bad. In this case, they've been pretty good. However, as it's getting bigger, it gets harder for the fund to outperform, because the more people who put money into this fund, the more that they're going to have to go out in the market and buy futures or options contracts or whatever they do. And there's a lot of academic literature that shows the bigger a fund becomes, the harder it is for them to outperform. Because if you've got a relatively boutique fund targeting, I don't know, Bangladeshi or Vietnamese small and mid-cap companies, that fund can be very nimble. It's a speedboat. But if you've got a huge, massive boat like the Titanic, everyone can see what it's doing, and it gets harder to actually use that money in an efficient way. So that's a final point, that if it keeps being successful, it will get harder for it to outperform. With that being said, I do think for the current environment, funds like that, dividend funds, not just a JEPI, are a pretty good play. And I bought it for some of my clients. So I'm not saying it's a bad fund. And I think for this year, it could well be a very good fund, because it's low volatility and it's given a good dividend yield. Even if you pay tax on that dividend yield, hopefully the fund will go up a little bit in value and the dividend yield will actually go down a bit, which means it could be more tax efficient for people as well. So I'm not saying it's a bad fund, but online there are some people saying I'm going to put 100% of my net worth into funds like this. And always remember, don't always follow the trend, because look at 2 or 3 years ago, what fund was hot then? It was the Cathie Woods fund, which was the ARK investment, which has done so badly since. I'm not saying this fund will be the same, because it's less volatile, so by definition it's not going to go down by 70%, but just bear in mind that yes, the current trend is for income and dividends and low volatility, at least for some investors, and that makes more sense in many ways. But by the same token, this fund isn't the be-all and end-all. It is a pretty good fund, but I don't expect the opportunity of 12% dividend yields to last forever.
Depends on every person's individual goals, how much money they want to invest, how long they want to invest. And I did not have at all the feeling from any bank with which I had contact with that they were interested in these things. Whereas with you, it was from the very beginning obvious to me that you had experience in these matters and also were interested in what I wanted to achieve.
Anyways, I'm very, very pleased and positive to say that I believe I've picked the right one. The results in the last couple of years have overreached my expectations by far. And I see no reason why it should not continue. Of course, I can highly recommend him as your financial advisor for now and for the future, because hesitating is missing out.
So I'm investing a lot in the Middle East market, but the amount of returns I'm getting from there is very low as per the amount of returns I'm getting from the investment portfolio which you made for me. Obviously, the best result in market right now is Adam.